Okay, we did cover this slide, I believe, right? Peace in the Boer War was May 31st, 1902. Transvaal Republic, the Orange Free State, became part of the empire. And it also covers the cost of the war. What we have now is just blank slides. Come on. It's not blank. There we go. Medical care. Medical care in the Boer War isn't that dissimilar from the Crimean War. It's just not as bad. Okay? There's not really a lot for us to talk about. The book doesn't cover it in great detail either. And which left a couple of you flounders. What are the key things you need to know? Well, the greatest issue is that supply is still a problem. But this time, supply is a problem not because, or not just because, people are kind of inept in ordering those supplies and making sure they're in place. But it's also because South Africa is, from the British point of view, nearly halfway around the world. Okay, it's really far away from home, much further than Crimea was. So that's a big issue. It's also an issue that getting the supplies to the ports in South Africa, like Cape Colony, no problem. But getting them from the colony all the way, from the port, all the way up through the Cape Colony, all the way up through to the Transvaal, well, that was a bigger issue. Okay? How many railroads were there? Yeah, it's 4, but they're connected, and so I guess you could argue, there's 2 clear lines, but then there are 2 that come more from the eastern side. That are counted as separate lines. Okay, but yeah, there are the 2 main lines from the south that run up north, and so you're trying to supply a massive army of troops. Okay, in the end, it's 485,000 troops that are transported to South Africa. Okay, that is far larger than the numbers that were in Crimea. So supply is a much bigger issue. Okay. Do you remember which general runs into supply problems in Bloemfontein? Really successful initially. Okay. Manages to relieve Kimberley, pushes on to Bloemfontein, runs into supply problems, and a lot of soldiers end up with typhoid. Who are the 2 generals that take over for Bullard? Kitchener and? I'll give you a big hint. That's a big hint. Who did I stare at? Good. What was the guy's name? Roberts. Okay. So Roberts and Kitchener take over for Bullard. Okay. And Roberts is fairly successful in relieving Kimberley, pushes on to Bloemfontein, runs into some serious supply problems. So supply is the issue, not just because of ineptitude, okay, but because relying on supplying that many troops in only those 4 railways is a major issue, especially in some of the key railway transfer areas like Ladysmith and Kimberley have been taken by the Boers. Those are the ones you're trying to relieve. Okay, so that causes further issue. And the Boers knew what they were doing. If they wanted to, early on, they were attacking the train lines. Okay, as you'll find out in a minute, that's how Winston Churchill was captured. Typhoid was the major killer here. What was the major killer in Crimea? Cholera. Typhoid was there too, but was not as bad. The symptoms are fairly similar. The way the disease is spread is very similar. It's a different bacteria. It's a bacteria that loves warm weather. Right? Guess what? South Africa has lots of it. Did Crimea have lots of warm weather? No, it was cold, so typhoid didn't do as well. Okay? But in South Africa, it's warm enough for the bacteria to reproduce like crazy. Basically, it's a bacteria that is in feces, and it comes from drinking water that's contaminated with fecal matter. Okay? You'd be surprised how much stuff has remnants of, I don't want to gross you out too much, fecal matter. How many of you keep your toothbrushes in a cup in the bathroom? Okay? Well, you keep your toothbrush probably pretty close to where you're doing the other expulsion stuff. It kicks all kinds of stuff up in the air.
Not that high.
No, still pretty okay. It used to be. Now, number of different reasons this used to be a problem, as Brett is pointing out. Like in London, typhoid used to be a major issue during summer because most people dump their sewage, their sewage buckets into the street, or if they live close to the river, straight into the river. Well, even if they dumped it in the street, guess what? One good rain, and it's all down in the river. Well, where's people's drinking water coming from? The river. Okay? So, in South Africa, typhoid was the big killer. Okay? In fact, as we know, again, in the Boer War, over 3 times as many people died from disease in their wounds than died in actual fighting. Okay? So you're looking at a number of about 6,000 to about 16,000. Okay? And typhoid was the major culprit. In fact, lots of Robert's men died when they got held up in Bloemfontein from typhoid. Okay? Part of it is still not the best understanding of how the disease is spread. But basically, you ingest that bacteria, it gets into your stomach, and it eats through your stomach lining and intestines and all of that stuff. That nasty stuff spills into your blood system. You end up with blood poisoning, and it's not good. Okay, not a nice way to go. Okay, on page 76, there are 2 documents, S and T. Now the page number might be off a little bit based on what I've got, what you've got. So,
page 70.
Yeah, it's on page 74 in yours. It's 76 on my digital copy, but it's 74 in yours. Okay, take a look at those 2 documents. They paint. Sorry. You were with me for lunch, you don't have to be clean. Just be clean about it. Those 2 documents paint very, very different pictures of what medical care was like during the Boer War. Okay, 74 in your textbook then. Okay, read them aloud for your neighbors.
Oh, is this the one that if they have beds, there was like holes in the beds with like
Now, these 2 documents, right, one of them's a picture, so I don't need to give you much time to look at it. Does the picture make things look like actually it's going pretty well?
Yeah. I'd say yeah.
In terms of the care of the soldiers, are they being well cared for in that photograph?
Oh, yeah.
Looks like they probably are, right? It looks fairly clean. These guys said they even have mosquito nets, right? So it looks like they're being cared for. first document, what's the issue that's highlighted in document S on page 74? No beds or mattresses, not many doctors. Okay? The issue is still supply, primarily. Okay? Doctors still have to volunteer. Okay? So there are still some issues with medical care that are ongoing. It's much, much better than the Crimean War, but that high temperature, which is the nature of South Africa, is going to lead to high rates of diseases like typhoid and lots of infections and things like that, right? Because infections love the heat. Right? Bacteria likes it warm. Okay. The role of the press. Now, there's a lot for us here to do, and I don't think we've covered it particularly well. So I would suggest that you guys even do take the time to take these notes down, and I'll try to slow it down a little bit. Okay? Because once we cover the role of the press, I would argue that the rest, the stuff that happens in the aftermath of the war, the party changes and things like that, we've covered before, and I will pull off a different PowerPoint to just run through it again. Role of the press, I don't think we have covered particularly well. The key thing here is that you have the emergence of a new kind of newspaper. It's the first daily newspaper published for the masses. Before this, the daily newspapers were fairly expensive, which means who read them? The rich people. Okay? Middle and working class couldn't afford to buy the paper, so they didn't read it. Okay? They would have heard, what the kids selling the newspaper were screaming out for headlines, but that was probably about it. The Daily Mail was founded in 1896 by Alfred Hamsworth. And he has a very different approach to newspapering. Okay? This is the 1896 version of the Sun. Okay? It's really easily digestible. He sees it as the first paper for the populace. It was cheap, and his goal was, instead of charging lots of money for the paper, he charged very little money but sell lots of copies. Does that make sense? Very different approach to what papers were doing before. One of the reasons the Sun is one of the cheapest papers you can buy is because they sell a lot of copies. It's the most popular paper in Britain. Okay? Because it's got boobs on page 3 to a large extent, right? It's got a very specific target audience, and it targets that audience very, very well. The Daily Mail did the same thing. It was similar things in 1896. There were no boobs.
Did it show that knee? No, it was Einfeld.
Yeah. In Victorian times, it would have been like the Bear Pig show. Ooh. The idea was to maximize advertising. Okay? If you have, and this is the way newspapers work now, right? If you have 500,000 readers, if someone wants to advertise in your paper, they reach 500,000 people. If you've only got 10,000 readers, someone advertising in your paper is only reaching a small audience. Okay? So by increasing the distribution, he could charge more for advertising. That was one of his goals. And that's what newspapers do now as well. But what's the problem, or what impact does that have on the way that news is reported? Right, okay? It's really dumbed down and simplified. It's sensationalized, okay? So that anybody who buys the paper can read it easily. It becomes entertainment, not news. Does that make sense? And that's sort of what the Sun does, and that's exactly what the Daily Mail did. Okay? There were more headlines, big, bold headlines, right? Shorter paragraphs. You going to use any complicated words? Nope. You want to make it as simple as possible. Okay? Most newspapers in the United States are written to the equivalent of 6th or 7th grade level. 12 and 13. Okay? The New York Times, before it was purchased by Rupert Murdoch, was the highest reading level of any paper in the country. That was grade 10, which is 16, 17. Okay? Not a particularly high reading level. There isn't a single newspaper published in the United States that's regarded at college level reading. Okay? So it's a very different approach, right? Newspapers want to sell, and if they want to sell, they're going to target, they're going to make it digestible by anybody. Okay? And that's why boots on page 3, right? The articles were rewritten to add spice and increase interest. What does that do in terms of making them historically accurate? Yeah. It's the Hollywood version of the news. You guys know what Hollywood does, right? It'll take some real event and kind of sensationalize it. How the hell else do you end up with a love story on the Titanic? Okay? And only in Hollywood is that going to happen. That the sinking of the Titanic, one of the greatest disasters of the 20th century, is a love story. Okay? That's kind of what the Daily Mail is doing. Lord Salisbury, you don't need to write this part down. Of course, Lord Salisbury said it was a paper written by office boys for office boys, right? It was really simple. Lloyd George said the Boers do not have the ineffable advantage of reading at breakfast every morning the great works of imagination, like the Daily Mail. Okay? Is he saying that it's reliable information? No. Okay? The war, very early on, was really popular, and the Daily Mail capitalized on that. It was said, and this is straight out of your textbook, that other dailies served the news up raw, right? Kind of gave you the facts and let you decide what to do with them. Whereas the Daily Mail served up the news cooked. The opinion was already there for you. You didn't have to think about it. Okay? It was one of your documents, or I think even the question itself says it was jingoistic. You know what the word jingoistic means? Yeah. There's patriotism and nationalism. Then there's jingoism. Jingoism is extreme. Okay? It's Jingo. After 2001, okay, September 11th, 2001, Americans were jingoistic. Okay? There's no other way to put it. They blindly followed whatever the government said, right? Bush said, "Woo, let's get Iraq," because they were involved. They weren't involved. They didn't have weapons of mass destruction, but Americans were like, "Let's kill them all!" Okay? They were nuts. They would have shot anybody they thought was involved. Okay? And they blindly followed it. When Bush's popularity fell, right, he would just say, "Oh, there's someone planning a terrorist attack. We're going to raise the security threat level to orange." And people are like, "Ah!" People in the Midwest believed that their water supplies were going to be attacked, right? They live in a town of 1,000 people in the middle of freaking nowhere, cornfields. And they're like, "They're after us!" Okay? And that's what was going on in the U.S. That's jingoism. Okay? How many of you studied Nazism in Germany in the 1940s? Okay? That is like so far jingoistic that there's very little comparison. Okay? That by the end of that system, yes, terror tactics were used, but the Nazis were so nationalistic, they just blindly did whatever Hitler told them to do. Okay? Without questioning it. And we saw some of that in studying Mao's China as well, right? After the Little Red Book and the Cultural Revolution, that's what was going on, right? They were just saying, "Oh, Mao, tell us what to do. Can I pee?" Okay? It was that extreme, okay? And so when the Daily Mail was jingoistic, okay? It was very much written frickin' rules, okay? This war shows the strength of our empire, right? We're going to kick the Boer butt. Okay? It's what always happens in war to some extent, but some wars more than others, and the Boer War certainly started out that way, to a large extent because of the mail. By 1899, and I would write this down, by 1899, the Daily Mail had a distribution of 534,000, which in that time is absolutely unheard of. It was by far the largest newspaper in Britain. Okay? And it had only been founded 3 years earlier. And those of you doing media, have you heard of the hypodermic needle effect?
Yes.
Hypodermic needle.
I have a
Yeah. Well, how would you explain it? Can you explain it?
It's literally, you get the information, you suck it out, then inject it into your viewer so that you get the message that you want into them.
Yeah. Okay. You take the information and you literally inject it intravenously into your viewer, and that's what the Daily Mail is doing, right? It's taking, information from the war, pre-digesting it, drawing out the important bits, draining its blood, and then injecting that directly into their readers. Okay? Opinion already formed. Okay? It's trying to influence a group of people. It's also the idea that your readers are going to blindly accept that. Does that make sense? Do people tend to believe what they see on the news, Jake? Ian? Yeah? Do you think people believe what they see on the news? Yeah. Pretty much without question. Okay? To the point that, right now, Fox News in the United States actively supports the Republican Party. Okay? They make donations to the Republican Party. Should a media outlet ever do that? Actively support a political party and campaign? Half of their, well, not half, but several of their primary correspondents are planning to run against Obama in 2012. Okay? Or the Republican Party. Do you think their news is slanted? Right? It couldn't be more so. Okay? The issue is that the Daily Mail was doing the same thing. Okay? Really pro-government. People believed what was written in it. Okay? The war drastically increased the sales of papers across the country. Okay? Again, this is a document. Our days are spent with reading our papers, ever clamoring for more. Our nights in dreaming of all that is and is not to be. In my lifetime, this state of tension is unique. The war affects all, rich and poor alike. All have friends and relations in it, and it is no exaggeration to say we are all plunged in gloom. I shall never forget last Tuesday in London when the news of the missing battalions arrived about midday. Picture the newsboys at the corner shouting, "Terrible reverse of British troops, loss of 2,000. Image the rush for papers as we all stood in the streets. There was a perfect sea of newspapers and anxious faces behind. Okay, this is a letter from Miss Bertha Singe in London. Okay, the newspaper was people's only access, right? They weren't going to the theater. They didn't have radios. So this was their television. This was what they talked about. You use the expression in this country, the water cooler conversation? Yeah?
All the time.
Okay. You know what I mean, though, yeah? They do it in The Office, right? In the British version of The Office. It's that as people get water, right, they have a conversation. They're always talking about some kind of late event or the latest episode of a TV show or whatever. Well, in 1896, the thing that everybody was talking about was what was going on in the Boer War. Okay? This was their entertainment. It was their livelihood. It was their connection to people that they knew that were there fighting it. Okay? War correspondents here are particularly interesting in a way because what happened in the Boer War was not allowed in the First World War and would never, ever, ever in a billion years be allowed again. Okay? You'll see why. It's pretty stupid. Interest in the war can be seen through the desire that newspapers had to have correspondents on the front line. Every major newspaper had one, and they paid them a lot of money. Okay, the best example we've got, and probably the most famous example, is Winston Churchill. He's 24 years old. Okay, he is one of the most notable journalists in the country already. He's in South Africa, and he's paid £250 a month. In today's terms, that's equivalent to £170,000 a year. Okay? He is paid an obscene amount of money. He's only 24 years old and pulling in £170,000 a year. That's more than your prime minister makes.
Wish I was Churchill. I don't care if it's
He looks not like Churchill dog, doesn't he?
Yeah. In his older days, I suppose you can see that comparison. Yeah. Okay? But here's the issue. Certainly, after 1899, he was a serving officer in the army, and he was a war correspondent. Anybody see an issue with that? He's going to be biased. He's going to have access to information that a war correspondent nowadays would never be allowed to have. Does that make sense? It's a bit of a conflict of interest, really, isn't it? This would never, ever, ever, ever be allowed in modern warfare. Okay? You cannot report on the news and be in the army. You cannot do them both. It's one or the other. In the Boer War, this was regular practice. Okay? So again, yes, that tends to be, there's a likely tendency for that to be biased and pro-British information, right? Because people in the army are not going to write incredibly negatively about it and about what's going on. They're certainly not going to highlight the kinds of issues that we saw through guys like Russell and Fenton in the Crimean War, right? They weren't in the military, so they were happy to point out every problem there was. In the Boer War, that didn't happen, certainly not at first.
Isn't that quite dangerous as well, though? Because, like, I mean, now if someone that's in the army writes, they're not allowed to tell you anything.
Yeah.
And he's an officer, so he knows stuff that most people wouldn't know, and he's sending that back home.
Right. That is potential danger on it. Okay? And in fact, actually, one of the documents you had for your question talked about that issue, right? That the correspondents did censor themselves to some extent. We'll get to it in a second. Churchill was captured in 1899. He claimed he was pressed. He's captured by the Boers who attacked an armored train. Okay? He claims that he's a war correspondent and he's pressed, and hoping that the Boers are just going to let him go. Okay? Which, in theory, they may have. But he actively defended that train as if he was just, serving in the military, so they took him. He manages to escape. Okay, he basically jumps train and makes his own way back to Natal. Okay? And when he gets there, Buller appoints him. Okay, he escaped. He makes his way back to Natal, and Buller appoints him lieutenant in the South Africa Light Horse. Yes.
If he hadn't jumped train, would they killed us?
No. We'll talk about that issue in a second as well. Not very long. At most, it was a couple of days, Aiden, but I don't even think it was that long.
You know, like, people that would be higher than him in the war and stuff, but they have learned that he was their correspondent. And that was perfectly fine.
Yep, we'll talk about that in a second too. Because he used to get a lot of information from Buller, who, was previously in command, but he didn't like Roberts. Roberts was too tight-lipped. He didn't share much of it. Okay, so he's appointed as a lieutenant in the South Africa Light Horse, and he continues to serve as a war correspondent. And I think that's probably the last point there. Okay, he continued to report for the Post, the newspaper he worked for.
Are we gonna get a question on this from Joshua?
Yeah, not on Churchill specifically. No way. You might get one on the press. All that, but not on Churchill. Okay, so the bits we really need to know, correspondents kind of had a conflict of interest issue, they were well paid by papers, were making their reputation, making their money on the backs of the Boer War. Churchill, his reports contained this kind of certain engaging honesty, okay? They did draw people in, they were really highly regarded. In general, Army censorship was really lax. What does that mean? Yeah, it was really informal, if you will. Okay? Now, to be fair, it wasn't quite as informal as in the Crimean War, where, Russell just got to write about whatever he wanted. He would just get a couple of officers drunk and they would spill their guts and then he would write about it. It wasn't quite that bad. For the first time, there's an official military censor. But to a large extent, most of the correspondents were officers and respected gentlemen, right? Winston Churchill, right, from this kind of regarded family background. So there was a tendency to just trust their judgment. To just trust that they weren't going to write anything that would undermine the military effort. So the work wasn't really censored. Now bear in mind, up until about 1900, really 1901, what was the popularity of the war? Yeah, it was really high. To the point that anybody who criticized the war was seen as unpatriotic. And again, that happens in any major conflict. When people in the States, when we went to war with Iraq, in the States, when people, came out and said, oh, this is really not good, we shouldn't be doing this, right? The response was really negative. Even in Albany, in my, home city, there was a protest march and a bunch of them got beat up, okay? Because they were protesting a war that now most people agree we shouldn't have gone to, but at the time, people were so gung-ho about it that they didn't want to hear anything unpatriotic. Okay? Some officers were more accommodating than others. Churchill found Buller very helpful, for example. Okay? He didn't find Roberts particularly helpful. His work did point out some deficiencies in the military, some issues, but again, not to the same extent that Russell did in Crimea. Part of that could be for a number of different reasons. Right? The fact that he's a member of the military could, certainly be one of them. Most papers overwhelmingly supported the war. Okay? Now, a lot of times there's this question of how things work. It's sort of like which came first, the chicken or the egg, right? You've got to ask this question: is the press manipulating public opinion, or is the public opinion already there and the press is just pandering to it to try to sell more papers? Does that make sense to you? Do you understand the difference there? Right? Do people already have their opinions and the press is just trying to sell papers, so they're agreeing with it and kind of fueling the fire that's already there? Or is the press starting the fire in the first place? Okay? And I think sometimes it depends on what's out there. Okay? Think of the case of Madeleine McCain. You guys all remember Madeleine McCain? How could you not, right? In this country, you mention the name Madeleine McCain, and someone doesn't know who she is, they've been living in a cave. Okay? Would you argue that that was something people were passionate about, or something that was stirred up mostly by the press?
You did not know that.
Yeah. Kids get kidnapped, unfortunately, pretty regularly. What's so special about Madeleine McCain? Right? Other than her parents were pretty stupid to leave a 2-year-old alone in a hotel room. What's so special about Madeleine McCain? Nothing. Okay? It's actually their parents have money. It was something stirred up by the press. Okay? It was something used to sell newspapers. Even now, every now and again, you get some, oh, Madeleine McCain has been cited in Maryland or wherever. Okay? Yeah, I mean, it's just, that's just the press kind of stirring it up. Okay? Because what does it do? People buy the paper and they want to read it out. They want to read that article. Yeah, the mom. Although they did still publish, even though the newspapers pretty much overwhelmingly supported the war, they did still publish things that didn't go well, right? Key issues like Black Wheat were kind of broken down in excruciating detail in what happened. The Boers were generally regarded as good soldiers within the newspaper. They were a formidable adversary. In fact, I think I may be stealing that straight from source B here. Yeah. Reviewing the whole situation, it is foolish not to recognize that we were fighting a formidable adversary. The high qualities of the burgers increases their efficiency. We must face the facts. The individual Boer.
Yeah, you did. You said burgers. Who the burgers?
The Boers.
Oh, the restaurant. High quality burgers.
Anyway, the individual Boer mounted in suitable country is worth from 3 to 5 regular soldiers. The only way to deal with them is either to get a man equal in character and intelligence as riflemen, or failing the individual, huge masses of troops. Okay? So either we get men who are as good in this kind of territory as the Boers are, which is going to be tough, okay? And we get them mounted on horseback and, make them as intelligent as the Boers, or we just get a whole crap load of troops. Which option did the British use in the end? A whole crap load of troops. Okay? Right. To be fair, absolutely. By saying, if you're saying the Boers are a bunch of idiots and we still can't beat them, that doesn't look so good on you, right? Okay. Part of it is part of a dispatch from Churchill himself, sent from Durban to his paper, the Morning Post, in January 1900. Okay? But the truth, come on, listen. Papers weren't necessarily concerned with the truth. Now, right now, newspapers are required, in theory, to corroborate any information they get. They have to authenticate it, right? They have to prove it's real, okay? Or they're supposed to. News agencies all the time get sued and fined for actually not doing that, okay? CNN got a huge fine after 9/11 when they showed old footage of cheering and screaming in either Baghdad or Afghanistan in the wake of 2001, right? They presented it as if, these people are cheering when the Twin Towers fell, but it was footage from like 5 years earlier, or something completely unrelated, okay? And so they got in a lot of trouble for that one and had to pay huge fines. Because what are they doing, right? They're portraying the idea that when the Twin Towers fell, all the Arabs all over the world started cheering in excitement. And that's not what happened. Okay? I have this morning seen an article written by a newspaper correspondent in South Africa stating that the Boers murder wounded men, and that this is a frequent incident. I venture to ask you to publish this letter for the sake of those tens of thousands in number whose anxiety for their husbands, sons, and brothers is great enough already without the addition of this fresh terror. So why is this person writing a letter? Right, to ease the minds of people who have family fighting in South Africa, okay, and to point out that it's not true. During the 17 months that I served in South Africa, I had perhaps rather exceptional opportunities of learning how our wounded were treated by the Boers. On 2 different occasions, men under my command who were dangerously wounded were attended to by the Boers. In each case, they were attended with the greatest kindness and care, and the wounded men themselves begged me to thank those who had been so good to them. I have spoken to many officers and men who have been left sick or wounded in the hands of the Boers, and in no single instance have I heard anything but gratitude expressed for the treatment they had received. Okay? So, were the Boers actually kind of decent to their wounded? Yes. What makes this document reliable? Right? So it's from Captain J.B. Seeley, who actually served in the war. Good. He's British. Well, why does that make it more reliable? Yeah. Because you would think that his bias is going to be the other way and say, oh, the Boers are evil, right? And a lot of times in war, that's what you try to do. You make the opposition seem really bad, really evil. In World War I, we saw the one of the German nurse pouring the water on the floor. Do you remember that one? Yeah? And the whole point of propaganda is to try to make the enemy look like the worst possible thing on earth. Okay? He's not doing that. So he's going against the bias that you might assume he has, which makes it more reliable. Okay? Be aware of that when you're looking at documents in the exam. Same thing, right? Should there be bias here? Is there? If there should be and there isn't, that makes it more reliable. Okay? If it's balanced and even. Okay? That essentially covers us for the role of the press.